Alrighty, sorry about that. So yes, we're sharing the results of the Not Yet Equal report, which is a partnership between SARAVYC, which is the Stigma and Resilience Among Vulnerable Youth Centre at UBC, and McCreary. Details are on the slide there of kind of if you want to download the full report, and we'll also put this PowerPoint up on our websites if you would like to a copy of that. Before we get going though, I want to start by acknowledging that both McCreary and SARAVYC are located on the traditional unceded lands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh. And we also acknowledge the continuing contribution to the lands of the Métis people. And obviously we're sharing data from across BC. So that's from young people living and attending school on the traditional unceded lands of First Nations people across the region we now call British Columbia. So the sort of aim of the report that we're talking about today was to revisit the question, is it getting better for LGBTQ youth in BC? We first asked the question in 2007 and we looked at data at that point back to 1998. And we were hoping to see kind of gains at that time, and there was some improvements, but not as much as you would hope. Since we did that report, there's been so much more that's gone on in BC to make the province more inclusive and more reflective of kind of sexual minority youth. The SOGI curriculum rolled out in schools in 2016 and things like that. So we were really hoping that this time around, we would see some narrowing of the gaps that we previously saw. So to do the analysis, we started with the 2018 data and looked at health behaviors and risk and protective factors for sexual minority youth in comparison to their straight peers. And then we looked at trends and gaps in trends to see if there's any changes over time. So I'm going to talk about the sort of 2018 data. Elizabeth's going to talk about the trends, and then we'll throw it open for questions and discussion at the end. But also, please feel free to sort of chip in and stop me if you would like, if you have a question, or to pop something in the chat box. So if you're not familiar with the Adolescent Health Survey, it's a survey of young people in grades 7 to 12, so that's age 12 to 19, in public schools across the province. It's been done about every 5 years since 1992. And in the most recent survey, more than 38,000 young people in 58 of the 60 school districts took part. And it's considered representative of about 95% of young people in mainstream school in the province. So before 2018, the question about gender was limited to the binary options of male and female. At that point, we didn't have a kind of valid and reliable measure for adolescents as young as 12 that got at alternative kind of genders. By 2018, things had moved on, and we were able to include 2 questions. So one was about gender assigned at birth, and the other was about current gender identity. So that included a non-binary option. So when I'm talking about the 2018 data, we can report out on non-binary young people, but for the trend analysis, which Elizabeth's going to talk about, we can only use gender assigned at birth because that's how we can match it to previous surveys. And throughout the report, we focused on sexual minority youth in comparison to their same gender straight youth. So we, for example, compared mostly straight, bisexual and lesbian girls against straight girls rather than against each other. So I'll pause a second just in case there's any questions before I get into the results. Okay. So on the slide, there is a breakdown by gender. Straight youth are the maroon bars, and then the different sexual minority youth are the 4 other bars. You can see that about 8 in 10 non-binary youth, 2 in 10 girls, and 1 in 10 boys identified as a sexual minority. Overall, 83% of BC youth in this age range of 12 to 19 identified as straight, 5% as mostly straight, 6% as bisexual, 1% as gay or lesbian, and 4% were questioning their sexual orientation. And we definitely saw that younger youth were more likely to be the ones who were questioning their identity. We compared risks to healthy development experienced by sexual minority and straight youth. And overall, we definitely saw that sexual minority youth were more likely to experience these challenges. And this in turn can help to explain the health disparities that they experience, which I'm going to share a few examples of now. So sexual minority young people were less likely to feel safe in their own home than their straight peers. So the examples for boys and girls are on the graph there. They also experienced other challenges in their living situations. For example, they were more likely to have been in care, been kicked out of home, or run away from home. So for example, 10% of bisexual girls had been in care compared to 4% of straight girls. And sexual minority youth were also more likely to experience food insecurity. You can see there on the graph that sexual minority boys and girls were twice as likely as straight ones to go to bed hungry because there wasn't enough money for food at home. Sexual minority youth also experienced higher rates of discrimination than straight youth, and not only because of their sexual orientation, which is what's on the graph there, but also because of things like their physical appearance and how much money they or their family had. We looked at bullying, including things like severe teasing, social exclusion, and actual physical attacks at school or on the way to or from school. And you can see on the slide there that the rates were higher among sexual minority youth. And we also saw the impact of this. So sexual minority youth were more likely to miss school because they were worried about being bullied, and were less likely to take part in extracurricular activities because they were worried about being bullied. Other forms of victimization were also higher among sexual minority youth, including sexual abuse, which is shown on the slide, as well as physical abuse as well. So we know that experiencing violence and discrimination impacts health, and we saw that sexual minority youth were less likely to rate their overall health as good or excellent, as well as their mental health, and they were more likely to report these as poor or fair. They're also more likely to report other markers of poor mental health, including being more likely to experience extreme stress or extreme despair in the past month. And this is to the point where they couldn't function. Also depression, anxiety disorder, PTSD, and other mental health conditions. And they were more likely to have self-harmed and also to have considered or attempted suicide. You can see the big difference in seriously considering suicide here, with sexual minority youth so much more likely to have done so than straight youth. And the pattern was similar for actual suicide attempts. So for example, compared to straight boys, gay and bisexual boys were 6 to 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide in the past year. We know that young people often use substances as a way to kind of try and help them cope. And sexual minority youth were more likely to use most substances they were asked about compared to their same gender straight peers. So substances such as tobacco, alcohol, or cannabis. They're also more likely to have tried these at a young age and to report that they were at a position where their use had become problematic. However, with the exception of sexual minority girls and cannabis, which is what's on the slide, they were no more likely to have used alcohol or cannabis recently and regularly in the past month. We saw that sexual minority boys and girls were generally more likely than their same gender straight peers to have had oral sex, but they were less likely to have used protection the last time they did so, and they were also more likely to have had sexual intercourse. Rates of things like sort of sexual health risk behaviors, like mixing substances and sex, and sort of consequences such as STIs, was similar between sexual minority and straight youth, except bisexual girls were more likely than straight girls to have mixed substance use and sex, to have had multiple partners in the past year, and to have been pregnant. Access to healthcare is a big area of concern, and we saw sexual minority youth were less likely to have seen a dentist or a family doctor in the past year. And if they had seen a doctor, they were less likely to have found them helpful. We do see that sexual minority youth are more likely to be accessing services such as a counsellor or a youth clinic in comparison to straight youth. But still, we see that sexual minority youth are more likely to have missed out on needed medical or mental health care than their straight peers. So we've seen kind of that the health picture is generally poorer for sexual minority young people, but we also know that many are thriving. So we looked at what was present in their lives that might be supporting healthy development. And we know that family connectedness is a huge protective factor for young people. We also saw, unfortunately, that sexual minority youth were less likely to have a supportive family than their straight peers, so less likely to have family who understood them, paid attention to them, or respected them. But when they did have these things, they reported better overall health and were also less likely to have missed out on needed medical care in the past year. And if they had a supportive family, they also reported better mental health. So the example on the graph there is bisexual youth, and you can see how much higher they rated their mental health if they felt their family understood them, and also less likely to have experienced extreme stress in the past month. School connectedness is the other kind of huge protective factor that always comes out alongside family. And again, we saw sexual minority youth were less likely to feel connected to school. So the example is on the slide there, is that they were less likely to feel like a part of their school. They were also less likely to feel safe at school. But when they did feel connected and safe, there were positive associations. So for example, 90% of gay boys who felt that teachers cared about them planned to go on to post-secondary, compared to just half of those who didn't feel cared about by a teacher. Also, those who felt safe at school were more likely to report positive mental health and were less likely to have experienced extreme stress or to have carried a weapon to school in the past month. Sexual minority youth were less likely than straight youth to be engaged in things like sports, so informal sports like kind of road hockey and things like that, or organized sports such as those with a coach, like soccer teams and things like that. But they were more likely to be engaged in the arts, drama, and music. And we saw that the more meaningful sexual minority youth found their activities, the more likely they were to have education plans for the future and to report positive mental health. So for example, bisexual girls who felt that their activities were quite or very meaningful to them were twice as likely to report good or excellent mental health compared to those who felt their activities were less meaningful. Friendships was interesting because sexual minority boys and girls were generally less likely than their same gender straight peers to report that they had multiple close friends in their school or neighborhood, but most had at least one close in-person friend, and they were more likely than straight youth to have multiple online friends who they'd never met in person. Sexual minority youth were also more than twice as likely as their same gender straight peers to have dated someone online in the past year that they'd never met in person. Sexual minority youth were generally less likely than straight ones to approach the adults in their life for help, but they were actually more likely to approach a youth worker or a mental health counsellor. And finally, we looked at connection to community, and we saw sexual minority youth were less likely to feel connected to their community than straight youth. But when they did, there was positive associations, including positive mental health ratings, and a reduced likelihood that they would miss out on needed health services. And for girls, it was also associated with a lower likelihood of being victimized online. So now I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth, who will talk about kind of the trends and whether any of the gaps have changed.
Thanks, Annie. I'm Elizabeth Saewyc. I'm a professor at UBC School of Nursing and the executive director of the Stigma and Resilience Among Vulnerable Youth Center, or SARAVYC, as well as the research director for McCreary Centre Society. As you've heard, a key part of the analyses that we did was actually looking at the disparities or the gaps among young people And at the same time, the second part of our research was actually focusing on trends over time. Not just the most recent survey, but also to understand whether those gaps that we see in the risks and health outcomes for sexual minority youth have changed at all over the years. Have they narrowed? Have they gotten wider? Or stayed the same? In our first Not Yet Equal report back in 2007, 15 years ago now, we looked at trends from 1992, 1998, and 2003. But we didn't have the statistical methods to actually look at trends and gaps too. So the reason this is important is that if a health problem is, say, going down, like smoking, for example, going down among gay and bisexual boys, but it's also going down among straight boys just as fast, then the gap between gay and bisexual boys and their straight peers will still remain. In 2014, we developed a new analytical method to be able to test whether the gap is significantly widening or narrowing or staying the same over time. For this sequel to our 2007 report, we looked at both trends and gap trends for a variety of different risks and health issues, and we're going to share a few of them here. First, given that violence is a key contributor to health problems, we saw some good news in recent trends. The percent of lesbian girls who reported that they had been physically assaulted at school in the past year dropped by half between 2008 and 2018. And bisexual girls and boys also reported declines in physical assault, which led to narrowing the gap between them and straight youth. Other types of violence, such as verbal harassment, social exclusion, or sexual abuse, had few changes over time, and the gaps persisted between the groups. In contrast, family situations appear to have improved because we saw significant declines in the percent of sexual minority girls and boys who reported running away in the past year, and these narrowed the gaps between them and their straight peers. We also saw some declines in substance use. For boys who reported recent cannabis use last Saturday, for example, that's shown in the graph on the left, you can see that the gap that was present in 2008 was completely erased by 2018. Sexual minority girls saw declines in recent alcohol use, but while the gap narrowed, it was still present in 2018. We also saw marked reductions in youth reporting that they had ever been diagnosed with a sexually transmitted infection. And you can see how wide the gaps were in 2008 for boys, but they narrowed a lot by 2018. Among girls, the declines were large enough that by 2018, there was no significant difference between lesbian, bisexual, and straight girls in their STI rates. When Not Yet Equal was first released in 2007, there was some surprise at the higher percentage of lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth who reported being involved in a pregnancy compared to their straight peers. Data from 2008, 2013, and 2018 BC Adolescent Health Survey showed that this trend continued, with sexual minority boys and girls still more likely to report having been involved in a pregnancy than their straight peers, except for lesbian girls in 2018, where there were no differences. However, the rates dropped considerably, and as shown here among boys, we also saw that the gap in the percent of gay and bisexual boys who had been involved in a pregnancy compared to their straight boys narrowed a lot. Finally, some positive news about one of the most serious health outcomes. While the gap persists in suicide attempts among LGBT youth and their straight peers, the gap has significantly narrowed, which is a promising sign. So, to return to our initial question, is it getting better for LGBTQ youth in BC? Sort of. The health disparities that are experienced by sexual minority youth compared to their same gender straight peers that were highlighted in the first part of this report show less progress by 2018 than we would have hoped for, especially given the more inclusive policies and practices that have been implemented across the province. However, the report has also shown that while progress may not be as quick or as broad as we wanted, there have been some significant improvement over time in the gaps which do exist. The report has also shown that despite the challenges to healthy development and that sexual minority youth face in this province, many of them are engaged in their community and school, have plans for the future, and have a circle of support. The report also clearly highlights the role that supportive adults can play for youth, and particularly those who lack support in key areas of their life, such as within their family or at school. The final question on the 2018 Adolescent Health Survey asked youth if there was anything relating to their health that they would like to see addressed in schools. The overwhelming response from sexual minority young people was for more sexual health education, which goes beyond the discussion of straight sex. Young people also called for more understanding of the mental health of sexual minority youth, greater supports to address discrimination, and for access to resources aimed specifically at them. Given these youth were less likely to access a range of healthcare services, their suggestions are timely and give us some clear indication of where we can begin to focus our efforts. In many ways, the findings in this report reflect those of our recently published report about the health of gender diverse youth and show the need for specific, targeted approaches to ensure gender and sexual minority young people feel seen and included in all aspects of family, school, and community life. For this reason, McCreary and SARAVYC are currently offering a healthy relationships curriculum aimed specifically at LGBTQ+ youth, and are hearing from young people who participate how important it is to have a space where they can talk about relationships with young people who have similar identities to them. However, such a program in isolation without other opportunities will not address the range of disparities in the health picture of sexual minority young people that has been outlined in this report. There's an urgent need to fully consider and include the perspectives of young people of all sexual orientations within the institutions that young people encounter. McCreary's Youth Advisory Council also offers youth action grants. These are small grants around $500 to young people and a sponsoring adult to support activities that promote the health of adolescents in their BC community. More information about the cool projects that have been funded and how a team of youth from your community could apply is on the McCreary website. And as mentioned a minute ago, UBC and McCreary are collaborating on a healthy relationship program called Taking Pride for dating violence prevention among LGBTQ+ young people in high school GSAs and in community groups across BC. Feel free to check out the information on our website and give us a call if you'd like to participate. And of course, research is a team sport, and a report of such depth actually takes a big team. Our sincere thanks to everyone who is involved in doing this research and creating the graphs, writing up the results, checking the numbers, creating the final report layout. Shout out to Hannah, and the amazing artwork that Alex Vandermeerel created. We also want to acknowledge the thousands of LGBTQ young people who participated in the BC Adolescent Health Survey over each of those years, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research for funding this work. And that's our presentation. We'll be happy to take questions or comments, and I'll stop the recording now.